The cabin sat in the timberline like a secret that never wanted daylight. Aspen lay far below, a glow of money and music and slopes and easy laughter. But up here, the cold trimmed every thought to bone. We hauled our bags through powder that swallowed ankles, breath pluming, hands burning inside gloves that suddenly felt too thin. The Airbnb listing had called it a rustic retreat. The boards carried a different word in their groans. The air tasted of iron, like a lip split on a tooth. We stacked wood beside a fireplace that wanted to argue with every spark. Meltwater ticked in the eaves. Behind the glass, the forest did not move. Yet the dark had the posture of something listening. I set my phone on the counter. No bars. A simple confirmation that we had stepped into a place where our lives would be told by older rules. Legends had followed me since childhood in bedtime stories about a Colorado monster that lived between snow and shadow. A werewolf that watched trailheads and counted heartbeats. In this light, those stories did not feel like stories. Floorboards flexed under boots. The kitchen smelled of pine cleaner and something metallic. We cracked the lock on the back door to inspect the generator and found prints stitched along the drift, not rabbit or deer, longer, wider, to clean in the toes. The snow had fallen all afternoon and kept falling. Yet the edges of those tracks held like glass. The silence built a second house around us, invisible and tight. When the wind died, the cavern's hearts sounded louder. Ducts breathed. Aging frames settled. Somewhere behind the walls, a line of heat hissed like static speech. The kind of stillness that maps a mind and then redraws it in the shape of fear. I told myself it would pass. I told myself we were tourists in the worst season and fear makes art out of nothing. I told myself many things people tell themselves when the monster has already chosen them. Night rose fast, a bruise flowering across the windows. Snow thickened to a white curtain that erased the world. The house grew smaller by the hour, room by room, like a throat closing. We put on music, low and bright, and the sound bounced around the beams, feeling thinner each loop. The generator coughed, caught, steadied. The thermostat shifted half a degree. The metal flue clicked as if a fingernail tested it. I lay down without sleep, eyes open, counting the pulses in my wrists. Somewhere between one breath and the next, a scrape began along the siding. Not wild scratching, not random, but a steady thread like a key drawn along a car, a mark being written with intention. It traveled around the house, deliberate as footsteps, patient as weather. I pictured the thing that belonged to that sound, and began to understand why the locals preferred their legends unnamed. The scrape paused under the bedroom window. The glass cooled. The night pressed its face to ours. In the absence of speech, the body becomes its own language. Skin prickled, teeth clicked once in my jaw as if answering an old signal. The scrape moved on, slow as a clock hand. The forest answered with nothing. A part of me drifted backward, through time, into those childhood tellings of beasts that stand upright and wear a man's shadow like a coat. I had laughed then, I did not laugh now. I slid from the bed without turning on a light. Every board warned me. In the blank room, I became smaller than my breath. The scrape came again, lower this time. Then a soft thump, as if something leaned a weight against the siding to feel the heat within. The cabin of terror, we call it now. But that night it felt like a mouth closing. My fingerprints were already on the story, and the story had claws. If the first chill ran the length of your spine, stay close to the pack and hold the line subscribe before the night takes what it wants. The wind returned. It carried a sound with it that should have been a dog's report and was not. Long, thick in the middle, a howl built for forests and funerals. The timbers answered with a low ring. The temperature fell a degree. I pictured the bones behind that sound, the old architecture of fang and hunger that does not forget its work. I set my palm against the wall and felt a tremor move through the studs as if the house had learned to shiver. The scrape resumed. The night took ownership of our names. Morning came as a dim confession, not a rescue. The snow had done its work. Drifts pushed like shoulders against the doors. We opened the back and stared at the prints stamped into the new fall. Heavy as stamps striking wax, 5 digits. The toes too long, the gate wrong, the depth wrong, where it had stood. The snow had cratered, edges fused to ice. The trackway circled the cabin, stopped under each window, and lingered by the back door, where the handle wore a faint smear that looked like grease until the cold taught the eyes to see. Not grease, something that dries darker. We followed the path 10 yards and then 20. But it ended where the trees began, as if the forest had swallowed the maker and belched silence. I felt the old stories unfurl inside my ribs, all the warnings that masquerade as entertainment. The Aspen lifts kept turning somewhere down the mountain. Money and speed and heat made their own city, but up here, the world returned to contract terms, scratched into bark long before language. The second scrape happened while the kettle sang. It ran from one corner of the house to the other, a casual autograph, a reminder that our time belonged to something with better patience. The sound landed on the nerves like a command. I kept moving because anything else would be a surrender. Snow fell. The sky kept its grey. The wind climbed and fell like a breath, learning self-control. Night carried a smell new to the cabin, wet fur and pennies. The generator hesitated and then insisted on living. Shadows aligned and then misaligned. The mind reached for reasons, and found only the architecture of dread, clean lines, strong materials. I walked the rooms counting steps. Under the bedroom window, 4 stones sat where there had been none, stacked with improbable balance. On the top stone lay a shred of cloth that did not belong to us. Panic behaves like weather inside a body. It has fronts and systems and little surprises. I felt the storm rise and tried to shrink from it, to let it blow over and call the thing outside a prank or a misread or a bear that learned a trick. But the marks on the siding had deepened into grooves. The doorframe wore new furrows near the latch, not claw swipes but test pulls. The forest did not produce humor like this. Lawkeepers and night listeners, leave what your family taught you in the dark below, and let the archive remember that old warnings still breathe. The sounds came with intervals now, purposeful gaps like rest notes, a circle around the house, a pause at the vents, a stretch at the door, footfalls that learned our map. The psychological horror began to tint the air a shade paler, as if fear had color and had leached into everything. I started to see a face in the window, and then understood the face was the reflection of my own fear. Sleep thinned to a film, breath found a new tempo. The kettle shrieked, and I flinched hard enough to throw hot water, then apologized to the empty kitchen, as if it could forgive me. In the sink lay a single hair too coarse to call human, and too straight to call dear. I rinsed it away, as if evidence had weight only when someone believed it. The wind carried a call again, this time shorter, closer. The cabin answered with a rattle in the ducts, as if the beast had found the house's lungs. Snow hissed along the glass. The world narrowed to wood grain and heartbeat. Survival is a connection to the simplest math. Heat plus quiet, water plus time, breath plus nothing else. We gathered those numbers and tried to hold them. Something leaned against the door with the gentle certainty of a shoulder. The latch clicked once, twice. The scraped varnish shone. The night smiled without a mouth and pressed a little more. The window in the kitchen surrendered without ceremony. One breath, the glass wore a skin of frost. The next, it produced a star, and then the star became a wound. And then the wound breathed. A weight slid through the frame with a speed that mocked its size. Snow flew, cold, emptied into the room with the eagerness of an invited guest. The creature stood with its back to the night and let the wind outline it, fur burnished by moonglaze, shoulders like barns, ears that tracked sounds I could not hear, eyes that held a color I had seen only once in a dying fire. A man carries a list of shapes he will never truly see in life. I crossed one off in that moment. Alistair the Werewolf. The name that stalks campgrounds and trailheads and late-night forums stood on the tile and shook the snow from its coat. The way a dog would if a dog weighed 3 men and remembered being one. Claws found purchase. The head moved as if counting us. The air filled with the scent of wet fur and the old copper of blood that has learned to hide. I reached for anything with a handle and found the iron from the hearth, its end black with old soot. The creature noticed, and its lip lifted in a smile that was not a smile. Its chest worked once, deeply. The sound that followed carried a surprise, a faint rattle inside the breath, the worn instrument of a throat that has sung to many winters. It stepped forward, and the house exhaled as if surrender felt merciful. There is violence meant for stories and violence that defects from language. The difference arrived with the first strike. The claw hit the counter and were disintegrated to sawdust. The second strike found the table and split it along the weak grain, as if the beast had been a carpenter in another life. I moved to keep it facing me, and nothing else. My body learned the room's geometry without my consent. The iron felt like a tiny lie in my hand. Another weight moved at the edge of vision, a friend's boot skidding, the involuntary sound a throat makes when it discovers its capacity for terror. The beast tracked that sound. Not my raised arm, it blurred left, then right, then owned the space where a man had been standing. The floor recorded an event and then forgot it again. Everything too fast for memory. A cabinet door lay on the ground in two halves. The refrigerator wobbled and then steadied like a man pretending he had not been shoved. The mind attempts language for what it sees. Monster, creature, werewolf, Colorado monster, Aspen legend, supernatural thing with winter for bones, all of it true and none of it enough. If the crack of wood and the snap of bone crawled under your skin, leave your mark with a like, and let the algorithm know you survived. The beast put its hand against the pantry door and pushed. The door did not argue. Inside, a friend cowered behind sacks of flour and cans, and the illusion that the world obeys hinges. The creature leaned, breathed, learned the shape of the fear. In that small space, a sound left the beast then, not joy, not hunger, something like recognition. I swung the iron and felt it connect with a weight that refused to call the strike significant. The iron clanged against tile, as if it preferred the floor. The thing turned back, and I saw the old wreckage in its face, scars that time had ironed flat. A history of silver that had kissed but not killed. A dull line along the ribs where a bullet had traveled and lost. Its tongue found one canine with the lazy affection of a habit. It stepped toward me with the gentleness a storm offers a house it intends to take. Violence became a room I could no longer leave. We abandoned language and obeyed the physics of terror. The living room gave ground. The hallway became a tunnel. The cabin in the woods forgot its promise of warmth and revealed its spine. Doors flew wide, hinges protested. The beast moved with a terrible authority, neither rushed nor slow, a sovereign crossing its old kingdom. We slammed a door and felt it catch against a body that refused to be denied. The latch wind and let go would split. The night entered on 4 feet that understood leverage. The generator faltered and returned, a drummer missing a beat and pretending he had not. Light crawled across the ceiling and clothed the beast in flashes. It did not blink. Its claws announced themselves to the floor. Precise and confident, behind me, a friend's breath jittered in short bursts, the lungs trying to leave the chest. The hallway collected people, the way a net collects fish. The cabin shrank again, and then again, an animal curling to protect its hurt. The first true blood came in a bright spray that looked unreal against all that pale pine. Not mortal, not yet, but a message. Fear obeyed like a well-trained dog. My hands adhered to the iron, as if glue had been invented for this purpose. The creature's head swung and registered every face, then returned to mine with a lazy certainty. I understood then that it had selected a narrator before it had selected a meal. The horror thickened into a syrup the lungs could not clear. We broke for the mudroom with the stupid bravery that thinks a second door equals hope. The back latch jammed under snowload. The beast did not hurry. It placed one claw between door and frame as if testing a tooth would soften to pulp. The latch dreamed of holding, and then retired. The door opened. The world returned to snow and wind and the smell that all prey recognizes. We poured out into it, because the house had finished teaching us one lesson and the forest would begin the next. Survivors speak in choices carved on nerves. Drop your move below, and mark how you would flee when the eyes in the dark refused to look away. The snow received us without mercy, ankles disappeared, knees waded, the world went blind with flurries. The beast moved through the drifts as if made for them. Knees high, shoulders sure, The light from the cabin showed our panic like theater. Then the generator choked, and the light died, and the theater closed, and the real show started. I lost the line of the group, and found the line of the trees. Bark scraped my jacket, and reminded me that the world contains rough surfaces, and they can be a comfort. The forest made lanes, and I chose one at random with the fast calculation of a body that wants to live. Everything narrowed to breath and sound and the knowledge that heavy claws have learned patience. The wind carried the faintest clink of something metallic and deliberate. Far off, a door slammed and then a voice arrived, not words, just the rhythm of a man whose life had been aimed at a single purpose. The beast veered. The forest changed course to accommodate an old feud. He came from the tree line, the way weather comes, underlit by his own knowledge, scarred hands, shoulder wrapped in a history of near-losses movement that wasted nothing. He advanced into the dead generator's silence, and the forest gave him space because even the trees had learned this step. Silver lay along his belt like a sentence with teeth. He did not show fear. He wore it the way a veteran wears an old jacket. Already broken in, already part of the skin, he did not waste breath on ceremony. He tracked the lines the beast left, through drifts, and read them as if reading music he had composed. The werewolf hunter, nameless in rumors, stepped past me, and, into the old debt he had come to collect, he spoke with his body and his breath and the way his fingers handled metal. He knew the name, the legends half-remembered Alistair, not a role, not a species, a particular wolf with seasons in his fur, and a ledger to settle. The fight that followed did not belong to our century. Silver rose and fell with economy. The beast answered with the stubborn grace of a monarch forced from his own stairs. Snow exploded, tree limbs cracked, the dark opened its mouth and let streaks of light run through as steel met a life that had refused to die when it should have. The hunter moved with memory. The werewolf moved with inheritance. Between them, our little human panic felt almost elegant in its smallness. Law filled the spaces that breath could not. The hunter had followed Alistair across counties and creeks and winters. Every encounter had taken something and given nothing. Scar against scar, they learned each other's math until the sums balanced only in blood. The hunter carried lines of silver, because silver is a sentence the curse sometimes understands. He carried other things too. Older things, iron in shapes that looked like prayers and traps that resembled patience. Alistair met them as a king meets petitions, with tolerance, then irritation, then the reminder of power. Inside the cabin, the marks became history. Along the door, new gouges along the window, a black polish of fur rubbed into the wood by repetition. The place had been chosen long before the listing, a den inside a map of rentals. A habit carved into the ridge above Aspen, a ritual that kept the legends fed. Horror Airbnb is how the mind dresses it now. At the time, it was simply truth arranged in wood and snow. Curses do not end. They eco-subscribe to the archive, so the next howl finds you first. The hunter's silver-kissed flesh and the kiss smoked. The beast recoiled, and then reasserted itself, with a blow that demanded a different noun than blow. The hunter folded. Rolled, rose, he wore endurance like armor, he carried years like they were tools. He knew the rules. He also knew that rules fail, and when they do, only hunger and will have a say. The forest watched, the house watched. The sky pretended indifference the way sky always does. The name traveled through the trees, not spoken, but understood, an agreement among old enemies. Alistair would not die tonight. The hunter would not stop. The ledger would remain open. Pages ruffling in wind that smelled like pennies and pine. I ran because every other verb had turned traitor. The storm closed around me with the thick generosity of a wet blanket. White built a new room every step. Trees stood like witnesses, too polite to interrupt. The sound of pursuit moved in stutters. Close, far, close again. The way nightmares pace themselves for maximum persuasion. The cold learned my name and tried it on. It fit. An outline surfaced through the storm. Angles of roof, a chimney nub, salvation for 10 heartbeats. Then not salvation at all. The abandoned cabin appeared out of snow like a story already told. The door hung crooked. The windows wore wooden X's, claw marks scored the jamb. Deep and glossy with old oil from a body that had pressed there sometimes to listen to warmth and sometimes to remember it. I pushed into the ruin, and the air inside tasted of mold and small animals and a patient despair. The floor sagged, the walls bowed with the memory of heavy winter. Snow had claimed one corner and built a luxury suite for a dead mouse. In the center of the room, a circle of ash spoke of a fire that had not burned clean. The smoky signature of desperate wood, wet with its own tears on a beam. The hash marks cut by something that disliked counting past, for wind rode its old arguments around the eaves. I crouched behind a collapsed dresser and made myself into a rumor. The storm muffled the forest and turned every distant sound into a maybe. Survival altered time into a string pulled tight. Breath in, breath out, count, stop counting, begin again, outside. The snow hissed with the neat rhythm of flakes dying on crust. The thing that hunted me slowed its pace, not winded. Simply choosing a tempo that would teach me respect. The first pass carried only scent, a wall of musk and copper, and winter itself. The second pass brought weight against the door, and a slow inhalation that measured the room. The third pass included claws testing the sill gently, lovingly, the way a musician warms an instrument. The boards groaned and went still. The storm filled the silence with white noise that became prayer, and then became nothing again. I thought of the hunter and his ledger. I thought of Alistair and his winter coat of scars. I thought of Aspen below, and the thin song of civilization that never quite reaches the places where wolves have learned to stand like men. I thought of my own life as a list of rooms and faces and the astonishing fact of being warm most of the time. The abandoned cabin disagreed with my autobiography and offered a revision written in cold and patience. Claws dragged across the roof, and the sound arrived inside my sinuses. Snowdust fell in glittering sighs. The creature settled near the chimney and listened to my heart play a solo. The room shrank another inch. My breath tried to climb out of my mouth, and I swallowed it back with the discipline of prey that wants to upgrade to survivor. Down in the trees, metal spoke again, a silver bell rung by hands that had not yet learned surrender. The beast lifted its head, the roof crackled. Weight shifted, the door received a blessing of shadow. Then the snow raced it all with the quiet grace of a sheet pulled over a face. When this chapter exhales, follow the howl that rises on the screen, and step into the next confession. Because the change that waits there has sharper teeth than this one. I stayed until the storm finished its song. I stood, and my knees debated emotion. The world outside wore a new skin, and I learned how to walk in it. The abandoned cabin watched me go with the resignation of a witness that will never be believed. The forest opened a corridor, and I took it. The ridge let me back onto its spine and pointed me toward a shape I pretended was home. Dawn bleached the world and left behind a museum of our mistakes. The Airbnb cabin wore its wounds without shame. The back door sagged off one hinge. The kitchen tiles held a constellation of new chips. The window paced itself with a spiderweb. Fracture around a frozen breath mark that matched the height of a tall man or a tall memory. On the sill lay a single hair that refused to melt, even when the winter sun tried its best. Inside, blood patterned the floor, bright in the places, brown, where time had already done housekeeping. The pantry had developed a second doorway. The mudroom smelled like coins. My friend's inventory would never balance again, some near, one far, none unmarked. The hunter had left nothing behind but the suggestion of a chosen path, and the faint print of bootlugs that had learned to write in snow. Alistair had left nothing but his signature, which is to say he left everything. We called the number that promised customer service and heard a pleasant human shape of sound explain policies with a warmth that could not thaw wood. We told the story to law in uniforms and law in parkas, and law in the eyes of men who have learned that certain claims do not belong on paper. The report became a shrug. The shrug became our burden. The cabin returned to its photo in the listing and smiled. Time passed. Aspen kept making winter for other people. I carried a new temperature in my bones year-round. The psychological horror moved in and paid rent with insomnia. Some nights I awoke with the old scrape already traveling the siding of a house many miles from that ridge. Some days I smelled pennies where there were none, and understood that scent can be a memory. In mirrors, I searched for marks that mean more than marks. A man becomes the story he refused when the story has stamina, so I tell it here, in a place that collects horror stories and bedtime stories that grew up and became true. A horror channel wants entertainment. I bring testimony. A real horror story does not ask for belief. It lays out its bones and lets your eyes do the rest. Jacob's account stands on snow and blood and old rules. There was a werewolf attack in an Aspen cabin of terror. There was a werewolf transformation on a kitchen floor that still smells like coin. There was a werewolf hunter who carried silver like scripture. There was a name in the trees larger than a species and older than a rumor. Alistair the Werewolf kept his history and added hours to the footnotes. I have learned to walk past windows without looking too long. I have learned to keep wood dry and locks humble. I have learned the math of survival and the interest it charges. When the wind drops on winter nights, I hear the house locate its spine. I follow the lines with my hand and remember that some walls have learned to bleed. The pack grows by whisper, not by mercy share. This account, if the night has ever stood at your door, and step into the archive so the next howl finds you ready rather than alone. The scar on the door of memory does not close, it becomes a frame. Where everything else is hung, I do not claim courage, I claim breath and the stubborn fact of waking. The ridge above Aspen holds its quiet. The abandoned cabin sinks a little more into its white bed. The Airbnb listing probably smiles a new smile in a new photo. The forest keeps census the way it always has, the way a ledger keeps ink, when the air turns metallic and the window cools and the timbers speak in low vowels. I listen, somewhere a generator coughs, somewhere silver rings like a bell not yet finished ringing, somewhere a name travels without sound and the snow carries it with the tenderness of a secret. I arrange my life around that truth and let the story keep breathing, because legends do not end, they lengthen. And for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our ultimate werewolf horror playlist linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.